So, perfect unison, C, C, 0 half steps, right? Minor second, so you've got 1 half step, right? C to D, so you've got 1, 2, so 2 half steps or major second. C to E flat, right? So C, D, E, that's a third part, and then we've got 3 half steps, so 1, 2, 3, half steps up, which makes it a minor third, 4 half steps, major third, 5 half steps, perfect fourth. Okay, here's if we have 7 half steps, it's a perfect fifth, like that, you can see. Now, and you can hear that it's really beautiful and resonant. Now, if we go back to our perfect fourth, 1 half step up from that is our tritone, which is right in the middle of these two beautiful perfect intervals. You can hear it, right? Really dissonant. So very dissonant sounding right there. All right, if we move on, here's our perfect fifth again. All right, if we keep going up in half steps, we've got minor second. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, just like that. Minor sixth. If we go up 1 more half step, it's a major sixth, just like that. And then if we go up 1 more half step, minor seventh, starting to get dissonant again, major seventh. This is going to be one of our more dissonant notes, right there. And then finally, last but not least, we've got our perfect octave. So again, another beautiful perfect interval. All right, so that's the bulk of your assignment for this week, at least, is just identifying intervals, basic identification. And if you need more help in your book, this is on page 57. Let's see. Now, if we go a half step either way, and this is where we get into wishy-washy territory. We add 2 modifiers to our major and minor or perfect. And we talked a little bit about this with the tritone. But, so there are further modifiers, and this gets into enharmonics as well. So, if we take, for example, let's see. Let's go with a third this time. All right. So if we have our thirds, so we've got our nice C to E flat, right? So here's our minor third, and here's our major third, C to E natural. If we go 1 half step in either direction beyond what we can do. So say we're playing C natural to E sharp. What? Technically the enharmonic to this is an F natural, right? I mean, normally we would see this as an F natural. You don't see E sharps too often in music. But, so if it were C to F natural, it would be labeled a perfect fourth. But it's not, right? It's an E sharp, which means that the interval is still a third. So we have to come up with a way of describing this. And what we've done is we call it an augmented interval. So you'll either see it written as an A, or oftentimes you'll see it written as a plus sign. So augmented can also be, if you see a plus sign, that's what that means. Now, if we take it back, so this right here, we've got 3 half steps, 4 half steps. This guy has 5 half steps in it, right? So it's got the same amount of half steps as a perfect fourth, but since it's written as a third, we've got to call it an augmented third. Now, if you go the other way around and say we go C to E double flat, right? Some of you may not know that these exist, but they do. So if you go to E double flat, which is the equivalent of D natural, right? So this is D natural. So normally we would see this as a major second, right? It only has 2 half steps between C and D flat, and then D flat to E double flat, if you want to call it that. And so we're going to call this a diminished third. The interval is still a third, but it only has 2 half steps, so we have to come up with something to delineate it. And you'll also see this written as, sometimes it's a little circle with a third next to it. All right, especially when it comes to identifying chords that are diminished or augmented, you'll see the plus and the little circle. Generally, when you're doing intervals, you'll see the D and the A, but it's not a guarantee, which is why I'm letting you guys know. So that's diminished and augmented. It applies to all intervals. If we apply it to a perfect interval, for example, which is what I was avoiding earlier, so in C's case, right? So if we have C to C natural, right? There are 0 half steps. We call it a perfect unison. Now, if it's C to C sharp, that's where we have problems, right? So beyond this, we can only have, so theoretically, this has 1 half step, right? So C to C sharp, but its interval is only 1. It's C to C, but it's a sharp. So we've got 1 half step, but we also know it's a unison, which means that we call it an augmented unison, right? Has your brain exploded yet? I hope not. And the same thing goes for if we did C, an interval of C to C flat. Same deal, all right? It's still an interval of 1, but in this case, we've actually got a negative 1 half step, which is kind of crazy. So it's a half step of a negative 1, and we would call it a diminished 1. This is pretty theoretical right here, but you will find it in theory issues. I think a little more obvious would be if we did like a fifth, for example. So if we do C to G, all right, we have a perfect fifth here. Okay, we've got our perfect set of 7 half steps. Now, if we go to G sharp, suddenly we've got 8 half steps. We're still a fifth apart. So we're a fifth, and we have to call it an augmented fifth. All right? Now, in the case of C to G flat, it's 6 half steps, which is a tritone, but we would also call it a diminished fifth, right? Because we're still a fifth apart, and we just call it diminished since we've got less. We're a fifth apart, but we have less than the normal number of half steps, right? So if it's 1 less than the normal number, it would be diminished. And if it's 1 more than the normal number, then it would be considered augmented. Okay? So that's kind of how augmented and diminished works. It also applies to all of the other perfect and or major minor. So in the case of sixths, the options are, diminished sixth, minor sixth, major sixth, augmented sixth, right? Same with sevenths. In perfect intervals, the options are only diminished fourth, perfect fourth, augmented fourth. So that's how diminished and augmented work. Hopefully you won't run into too many of those in these assignments, but the later ones you do. So just be aware of that. Let's see. How am I doing on? Okay, so let's get to assignment 3.1. Just to give you a little bit of an example. So 3.1 just wants you to literally just identify the intervals. So count the half steps and identify them. So our first example is number 1. We have an A to a C sharp. All right. So we count our intervals. We have A, B, C. So we know it's going to be a third of some kind. And then we just count the half steps. So we've got A to B flat to B natural, B natural to C, and then C to C sharp. All right, so we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 half steps. All right, which means that it's going to be a major third because minor third has 3 half steps. And that's all you're doing for that. There are a couple of tritones, so let's talk about that. I'm going to skip down to number 13. So it's and check it out. Second line, or the second stave, is in bass clef for all of these, so just be aware. So in 13, we've got a C to an F sharp. Let's take down this. So if we do C to F sharp, all right, so we count. We've got C, D, E, F. We know it's a fourth for sure, all right? So we can't do anything about that. And then we just count half steps. So we've got C to C sharp to D, right? D to D sharp to E, E to F, and then finally F to F sharp. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and finally 6. So we know it's got 6 half steps. What has 6 half steps? Not a perfect fourth, that's for sure. So perfect fourth has 5 half steps, which means that this must be a tritone. And it's an augmented fourth. All right? So that's all that is.